everybody for joining us for another episode of Skooled Podcast. Today, I'm joined by two people. One, my other half, husband, Jason Clark.
Hello.
And the other, we've got a licensed therapist. She deals with marriage and family counseling, and she is well known by many people. Her name is Kiaundra Jackson. Kiaundra, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is exactly that you do?
Absolutely. I'm super excited to be on with you guys today. For all the people out there in La La Land who don't know who I am, like Nia was saying, my name is Kiaundra Jackson. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California. I'm also known as America's #1 relationship therapist, and I've been featured on the Emmy Award-winning TV show The Doctors, BET, Fox, Vice, the CW, you name it. I've done so many amazing things, and I've been named by the Huffington Post as one of the top 10 black female therapists you should know. And I'm just super passionate about healthy relationships and mental health. So that's just a little snippet about me.
And that's a lot. That's a lot under your belt.
Yeah, I was going to say, I better not sidestep or anything. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, she obviously knows what she's talking about. So today I thought it would be fun and yet eye-opening to tackle something that a lot of couples actually avoid tackling in relationships, and that is money and how money impacts relationships. And today we're specifically focusing on millennials and young adults, because the way millennials and young adults perceive money, their own experiences with the economy and the job market, the Great Recession, has greatly impacted and shaped their perspectives with regards to money and how it relates to relationships. And I noticed that when it comes to, for example, my own marriage, and I compare it to that of my parents' marriage or even Jason's, it's different. So particularly what I wanted to do was talk about what we as young married adults can do to avoid letting money come in between our relationship, sort of ruin our relationship, really, because we do know that many relationships end because of financial reasons. Is this something you deal with or you see a lot in your practice, Kiaundra?
This is good stuff. So I'm glad we're talking about this today, because you guys hit the nail right on the head. Is that right? The nail. Yeah, the nail on the head, because I always say that the top 3 reasons, or I call these the top 3 relationship killers. And it is money, it's poor communication, and it's sex issues. So you guys are talking about one of the reasons why couples break up, why people get divorced, and I think that this is a really hot topic. So, yes, you are 100% right on that money can tremendously have an effect on people's relationships, because we don't know how to necessarily handle it appropriately. And when you're blending two people, especially from the millennial generation, it causes a little bit of conflict, because it's like, well, how do you handle money? Well, that's not how I did it. Well, I didn't see my parents do it that way, and blah, blah, blah. And so it can get a little muddled. And I think that it's something that you can't avoid not talking about in your relationship, because if you do avoid talking about it, oh man, it's gonna be a nightmare.
Yes, I have to say my husband and I might be a little bit guilty of that. We definitely talk about it ad nauseum now.
I feel like we talk about it all the time.
but and we do talk about it a lot now, because I recognize that in the beginning we hardly ever talked about it. And when we got engaged, we didn't really talk about it until maybe a year into our engagement, maybe 8 months to a year into our engagement. And then we started.
That's because I said, it's okay, babe. It'll be okay.
Yes.
That should be enough. That should be the entire conversation.
Oh, well. What I started to realize is that it wasn't going to be okay unless we got real about our financial circumstances. And I'm so glad we did, because we ended up saving a lot of money on our wedding had we not had that conversation. And I really thought it was just going to be okay and money was just going to fall out of the sky. Then we would have probably paid twice as much for our wedding as what we paid. So,
or we'd be waiting and still be waiting to have our wedding.
We would probably be waiting to have our wedding. And I was opposed to that because, chick is not getting any younger, so we want to continue on this timeline of life in a reasonable amount of time. So anyway, I use us as an example because, candidly, money is something that is a point of contention between my husband and I. Sometimes we perceive it differently, we handle it differently. I will say, though, I'm very fortunate to have a husband who's very supportive of us financially. What I'm concerned about is that, with regards to both of us, for example, we both have student loan debt, and people who have student
Join
loan
the club.
right. Yeah, significant. We both have, he went to law school, I went to graduate school, we both went to Ivy League, school. So, yeah, we got student loan debt.
6 figures easily.
Yeah. So, and of course we're trying to figure out how on earth we're going to pay all of this money back eventually. But in the process, there's a certain amount of shame that comes with that. And there's a tendency with that shame to not want to talk about it because you feel embarrassed and you don't want to even face the fact that you've got this monumental amount of debt hanging over your head. All the while, people are telling you the world is your oyster and you can be all you want to be.
Right.
So how do you help couples get to a point where they're comfortable talking about their finances, regardless of how much debt they may have or how much shame they associate with their finances?
That's a great question, and it's interesting how you mentioned that you and your husband talked about it like after the engagement. I encourage people to talk about this as early on as possible, like even in the dating stage, because truth be told, a lot of the stuff that we believe, the beliefs we have about money, how we handle it or mishandle it, is rooted in our childhood and what we saw and what we didn't see growing up. And when we don't have these candid conversations, we just assume that we know that's what the other person is doing with their funds. And so I think student loan debt is a different category than somebody who's out here buying, Jordans and red bottoms, like every other week when they're supposed to be saving for a house or, something, or they have massive credit card debt because they have erroneous spending. I think that that's a different category than student loan debt, right? Yeah. But all of it still needs to be talked about regardless. And so I tell people to start with the basics of, like, what are your spending habits? Like, do you save? Do you even have a savings account? Like, what does that look like? How much are you putting in? What did you see your parents do or did not do? How were you raised? Because when I look at my life, right, like I was born and raised in Compton, like CPT, whoop, whoop. So I've seen a lot of poverty, and there were times where we didn't have a lot of money, and we had to, like, eat the same meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so I used to hoard money a lot because I didn't know, like, when the next time we were going to have certain things. And that affected how I managed and was in my relationships, because I was with other people when that's not their narrative, right? And they had more money, and it was more flexible, and their parents were a little bit more wealthy, and they were just spending money like crazy. And I'm like, wait, what are you doing? And so we had to talk about those differences and what that looks like. And so very similar with millennial couples, like, they have to have those conversations of, like, how was money handled in your household growing up, because that'll give you a glimpse into how they're possibly going to handle money in their marriage or in their relationship.
So you're absolutely right, and I absolutely see that reflected in my own marriage. I think, I'm not going to get personal about our situations growing up, but suffice to say that for me, money was more of an issue growing up. And I lived in a relatively middle-class family. However, money was still an issue. And so, whereas I'm not sure Jason had that same experience. And Jason, why don't you talk for yourself instead of letting me talk for you?
You're here.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. For me, obviously, money is a factor with everyone, and I just always felt that the value of the dollar is important. So I mean, I've never really been one to spend a whole lot of money on things, and that was actually really where I was thinking maybe we had. Well, I was curious in hearing more about, because you're talking about how you got to know what people's characteristics are, their spending habits are. They're spending a lot of money on things. I know at least we're talking to folks who maybe don't spend that much money, because I don't think Nia necessarily spends that much money on many things. I don't think I necessarily do either. But you still have all these loans, and you still have all these other issues, and
Totally.
you're still trying to get by. And I guess what I would ask, which I don't know, maybe some of the people who are listening to us are in the same boat, is it's like when you feel like you're doing all this stuff you're supposed to, you're being frugal about things, and even when you have a job that's, not paying a lot, but at least paying, a decent amount, and you're still struggling, like essentially paycheck to paycheck, like what is it that you do? Like how do you, like what are some of the steps that people who don't have bad habits can be doing to make sure that they could think about getting a home at some point in their lives?
Yeah, I think the key part of that one is saving.
And thank you, yes.
Yeah, and accountability with it, you know, because let's be real, I've seen and worked with so many different couples who have separate bank accounts, both of them, and they don't have anything blended. I have people who blend all of their money together, and then I have people that's like, we have our own individual, but then we also have another account that's conjoint. So it depends on how you guys are handling your accounting, your finances, but accountability as well. So if, depending on how you have your account set up, but hey, if we're going to put $100 into the account this month because that's all we can afford, like I need to make sure that you're doing that and saving and not going out to, all of these fast food restaurants or getting Starbucks or, just like the small things, because oftentimes people think like, oh, I'm saving, but when we look at it and you really pull up somebody's bank account, they're buying a whole bunch of small stuff that really adds up. So it's those Starbucks, it's those stops at McDonald's, it's the, running into the gas station to get some candy or some chips, and all of that stuff adds up. And so we have to be a little bit more conscious of that. And sometimes you might have to, make meals at home or go grocery shopping and meal prep and plan for the week, and do things of that nature. And it's especially if you have a goal. So every couple needs to have financial goals.
Thank you.
Point blank.
You're like taking the words out of my mouth.
I don't care if it's, saving up just to have an emergency fund or to go on vacation or to buy a house or to save up because you guys don't have kids soon. Whatever that looks like, everybody should have some type of financial goals and create a full strategic plan of how we're going to get there and what we need to do it. But that requires conversation. So if you're not comfortable saying, hey, what your spending habits look like and how were you growing up, then you're not going to be comfortable saying, hey, we need to put aside a few $100s to go on a trip or to save for a house. So it starts with those small day-to-day conversations.
And what I was going to say is, Jason and I, we don't have a problem where one of us spends way more than the other. We're both reasonably frugal people, but the problem is how we view money. And so I'm always thinking about like the long term, like what's our long term financial outlook, because I understand that we can have, like, we're always one emergency away from bankruptcy, right? And so in order to not put ourselves in that position and also to keep our marriage healthy and, not strained by finances, I'm always trying to stress the idea of like long-term financial goals, whereas sometimes I feel like Jason's perspective is a little more like short-term financial goals. Not that one is better than the other, but how do we meet each other in the middle?
Yeah, and even to that point, even to flesh out my side more, like I agree with, obviously long-term goals and everything is important, and I see that. But what I always think about, at least when we have these conversations, are that makes sense, but I don't want to spend money on all this interest. So if we actually get rid of some of the debt you have, then long-term you may have more money in certain ways. So I guess from using those points of views, and maybe there are other people who have those, points of views in their conversations, like how do you figure out like the best balance for the two?
Yeah, and I mean, like, if you have significant amounts of debt, I mean, it's wise to try to pay that down as quickly as possible, whether that's credit cards or student loans. But we're talking about millennials here, right? So I'm also a millennial, and the beautiful part about millennials is that we're super creative. We're not the, baby boomer, stay at a job till you're 70 years old type of generation, right? We're very creative. We out here Ubering, we out here Grubhubbing, Postmates, whatever needs to be done, right, in order to get the things that we need accomplished. And so I think that's when that creativity and that side comes in and say, hey, maybe I need to get a side hustle, or maybe I need to pick up another part-time job temporarily so we can pay down this goal, and then we can say put more money in the savings account for the house or whatever the case may be. So sometimes we have to think outside of the box and get a little bit creative to bring in that extra income, and then just go with the flow, because I don't think we have a problem with doing that as millennials at all.
You know, one of the things that's interesting, speaking of being millennials, is how much the idea of, you know, financial security impacts our perspectives of marriage and long-term relationships. And I'm sure you see this a lot, where a lot of people in our generation just are delaying marriage or just foregoing it altogether, because there are a lot of us who did, you know, go to school or graduate during the Great Recession and are still sort of, you know, suffering the consequences of that in some shape or form. And that sort of traumatic experience, that sort of traumatic financial experience, I think it really did a number on a lot of people. and
totally.
You know, I mean, Jason and I probably are both older than our parents were when we got married. And I'm almost positive a large part of that had to do with the fact that we just didn't want to get married in a really bad financial place. We also needed to find the right person, right?
That part.
So it all kind of worked out, right? But seriously, I mean, I think, you know, one of the reasons why a lot of people maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago were more willing to get married younger is because a lot of, you know, especially when you talk about gender roles, a lot of women especially didn't have to consider their financial security as much, right, as we do today. So that, and so it's always like, you know, and growing up, I definitely saw how finances put a strain on my parents' relationship. So it's always been a fear of mine, right, that I would sort of repeat that cycle in my own marriage. But then sometimes I'm afraid that I'm doing things that are counterintuitive because I'm so afraid, right, of letting, you know, for example, I know that Jason has certain goals and some of them don't always line up with my financial goals, right? And so how do you help couples understand how to be more considerate of the other's financial circumstances with regard to the relationship?
Yeah, we have to understand that even though because you get married, you're still your own individual person. Like, you still have wants, needs, desires, hobbies, things that you wanted to accomplish on your own prior to getting married. And yes, you know, when you get married, I believe that you do become one, but you can't just forsake all that you wanted to do as an individual and lose your individuality because you're now married. So yeah, there will be some things that your partner wants to do, you know, that may affect the income of the household, but it's all about, I call it not even balance, but it's all about harmony, because balancing means, you know, something has to, you know, there's going to be a give and take, and something has to kind of like be out of whack for the other one to succeed, but you have to find harmony in that and saying, okay, hey, you want to go on this, you know, trip, and it's going to cost us a few $1,000s because this is a good business move or a good work move, and that's just the way that this is going to be in this season. So we have to think of relationships and our finances almost like in blocks of time versus thinking about it in its totality, right? Just because you spend a few $1,000s on a certain thing right now that's important to an individual in the marriage, that doesn't mean at all that, you know, you can't get back on track, or that it's going to have a detrimental, you know, impact in your relationship. Because to be honest with you, I think not doing something that one of the individuals in the marriage wants to do will probably have a more negative effect than actually just dishing out the money, because they're going to be dissatisfied, and they're not going to even feel like you're on one accord, you know, and like, oh, you support me, they're going to feel unsupported.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So sacrifices. Sacrifices.
Right.
Yeah, sacrifice.
He's like, yeah, sacrifice.
Support me.
See,
right.
The expert says Jason is right.
Okay. So there's...
Okay, I did not say that first.
No, we're ending this podcast right now. I think this is a great time.
Anyway, so there's this Census Bureau study, and the article that corresponds with it is called Money, Marriage, and Millennials. And it is really scary. it shows, based on 5-year estimates between 2012 and 2016 of young adults ages 18 to 34, the current study found that the median annual wages for all working young adults is $20,000, about $20,000 per year. Amazing, right? 18 to 34.
Yep.
And the poverty rates.
That is scary.
The poverty rates are 15.9% for young adult men, 21.8% for young adult women, and only 9.8% of young adults own a home. So with that in mind, I am quite sure those numbers are a lot worse than what they were when our parents were that age, but it becomes a lot easier to understand why people are so apprehensive about, joining a union, which is not just in holy matrimony, but also, financially as well. If the financial insecurity of so many young adults is so stark. And what's also interesting is that this study also says that young adult men in particular faced greater employment challenges following the Great Recession. So when we talk about gender roles, right?
Totally.
And we talk about, men feeling like they need to be the provider and they need to be the supporter of the family and so on and so forth. That's changed a lot, at least among my generation. I have a lot of female friends who very much earn their male counterparts, and a lot of men they entertain, or who just earn the same amount of money. So how do you, Kiaundra, in, just your work, how do you find the idea of gender roles fitting into marriages, especially of young adults, when it comes to finances, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I think there's been a huge shift in that area as well, because you're right. Like, as women in general, we're just like kicking butt in comparison to the income that most men make, and we're just killing the game as far as entrepreneurship and, our median income. And so when you're bringing that into the table, and I hate to keep going back to this, but it really does go back to what you believed, even if money was not on the table. So what are your gender roles and expectations that you saw your parents growing up with, right? And hey, did both parents work? Did one of them stay home? Are you expecting, meals Monday through Sunday on the table, 7 days a week, house clean? Like, what are your expectations of that? And is that realistic? Because if we as women are working as equally or more and making more money, we don't have time.
Right.
Listen, men, we don't have time to do that. So there needs to be some type of compromise of saying, hey, I can cook 3 times a week, or I might clean up, or we can get a maid, whatever we need to do, but there needs to be some type of compromise, because if not, things are going to get out of whack. And so what I found is that men do have an ego that they have to check.
Like it's something.
Yeah, I had a little allergies today, but, men do have an ego that they have to check in regards to the relationship, and understand that their love for their significant other isn't based on the amount of money that is being made by her. And then also, too, for the woman, like, I know some women who get high and mighty, and they're like, well, I make more than him, and I can do this and do that, and that they feel more superior. And it's like, that's the wrong attitude to take if you want this relationship to work as well. So it's a balance. It's harmony, actually. I take that off the table. It's harmony.
And I'm actually very fortunate in that Jason's very supportive of me in my career, in terms of, my goals, career goals, financial goals. So, but the pressure is so real, right? Like, I work very crazy TV hours, and I really try to make sure that when we do spend time together, I invest in him. But it's so real, and I see some of my friends struggle in that area with being successful, having, significantly higher earning, potential than a lot of their male counterparts, and being able to find somebody who can respect that and appreciate that. and still not expect them to be superwoman 24/7. And that is something I think our generation is still trying to find our way, because like you said, we may have different views than our parents, but it is our experiences with our parents as children that largely shaped our perspectives of the world and how we relate to our environment today. And I definitely have felt that pressure, like in previous relationships with, men saying, well, you work too much, right?
And then you should say, well, I'm clearly not the one for you.
I did. Luckily, I did. And found somebody who I was the one for, right?
And to be honest, I think it's literally all about teamwork, because if we're talking about, okay, if you're just in a relationship and, you have these differences with money, that's a whole different ballgame than when you're married, right? So my perspective and what I really encourage most people to think about is that when you are married, you become one. Your money also becomes one. A whole bunch of things become one. So if I'm bringing in $100K and you're only bringing in 50, I'm not thinking I'm superior because I bring in money. I'm saying our household together, we make $150,000. Do you know how much we can do with $150,000 collectively? It's not my money, your money. It's we. Right. We have $150,000 now, right? So when you take on that perspective and you look at it from that lens, oh my goodness, the game actually switches.
That's really interesting.
Is that how it's been, though? I try to think, and that all makes sense, and I agree with it all. But when you think about, generations before, especially given that the men usually made more money historically, and then they're the ones who would make a lot of the same decisions, it does seem, whether it's at least there's been this history of people feeling that if they make the most amount of money, that they deserve a bigger part of the decision-making pie. And what would you say to people who say something like that?
I think that's insane. You do not deserve a bigger part of the decision pie, because, again, your love for the person is not based on money. And yes, historically that has been the case, but we're in a whole new generation where we're rewriting scripts for everything about how we see jobs, relationships, marriage, money, all of the stuff that Nia just read from that article. So why can't we shift our mindset on this too? And granted, let's be honest, there are still going to be some millennials who do prefer more traditional gender roles and who wants the male to make more money and be fine with that. And that's completely cool. Like, if that's your jam, go for it. But then there's going to be a whole different set of individuals, such as myself, who is probably going to out-earn my male counterpart often. And I'm fine with that. Like, I don't care about that, because I don't want to come home and still have to carry the cape of the world. You know what I mean? Like, I want to take off my cape, and if you want to make decisions, you go ahead and make decisions. I make decisions all day as a boss. So I take all that off when I come home, and I have a different perspective. So it's just all about how you navigate it.
And for the record, Nia, I have no problem with you making much more money than me. So
yeah, I know. I'm sure.
Go get that money.
And I was just about to say, our
account, right?
I have no problem with being a stay-at-home wife if you decide that you want to make double than what you make now. That's actually okay.
There you go.
Too, so
you see that compromise, that sacrifice right there?
And let me tell you, I became enlightened after getting married. I was like, I get why somebody would want to stay at home.
That's a trick.
No. I could tend to my wonderful husband, make sure the household's in order, and I don't have to go gray prematurely because of my job. I get why people want to stay at home. I do. So
totally,
no judgment over here.
And I see why people also want to go to work too.
Yes.
If they're stay-at-home parent, they're like, oh, this is a lot.
Well, it's funny because Jason and I had that conversation, and I said to him, one day that I thought maybe at some point in the future it might be beneficial to see what it was like if I just didn't work. And he woke me up, and he said, you just get bored. And I was like, yeah. You're right. I would.
Yep.
So,
absolutely.
And it's important to be realistic. But there may be a
season where that might be okay, right? Say if your friend just had children or something like that and you want to take a year off, like, that's perfectly fine, So it depends, because I tell people marriages go through seasons. What you thought you wanted in the beginning may shift and change, and you have to be ready for that pivot.
This was great. I just have one more question before we close, Kiaundra.
Sure thing.
When it comes to, because I know for me it's quite a challenge, and I'll be honest about this. It's quite a challenge to view my finances in the vein of them being conjoined with somebody else's. Like, Jason's amazing. He'll say, what's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. But honestly, I never thought about it until you said, hey, if you make 100 and I make 50 and we put that together, imagine what we could do. Never considered that. I considered what it might be like in the future when we, but it still is. And it probably has a lot to do with my childhood and the way I saw my parents handle their money, both together and separately. So do you suggest, financial counseling, for couples, or having a financial advisor to sort of help them get more comfortable with, being honest about, because honestly, for me, being honest about my finances is just as personal as being honest about, my previous dating history.
Yeah, I agree 100%, and I would recommend that for individual, even if you're not married. Like, getting your finances together and doing all of that before you say I do is imperative, and even this is something that should be discussed early on in dating, and even very extensively. I go over this like a trillion times in my premarital counseling sessions, but that's so important because you will save yourself a lot of heartaches and a lot of arguments when you're on one accord, or at least you're knowledgeable of why the person, does what they do, right? When you are aware, like, oh, they hoard money because they didn't know where their next meal was going to come from, or they didn't know when they were going to get another pair of shoes. That's why they do what they do. Then it gives you a little bit more sense of understanding of your partner versus like, oh my gosh, you never want to spend your money. You're so boring. You don't want to go on trips. What is wrong with you? You have a different perspective. And so yes, actually get a financial advisor, get a financial planner, get your finances in order, because this is one of the reasons, again, why couples are divorcing and, why people are breaking up. When I surveyed all of my divorce lawyer friends, this is one of the reasons they said money. Wow. And I was like, oh, wow.
That's good.
So stay on top of this.
How do you even broach
continuously?
I'm sorry, how do you even broach the subject when you're dating, right? Because I couldn't imagine asking Jason, okay, what's your credit score? Like a year in, right? I just feel like I might as well tell him to run away.
a year?
Yes.
It's a long time to actually.
It is.
I can see if you're talking about the first date or something,
No.
then of course I wouldn't advise that. But if you've been in a relationship with someone for a year, you went through 4 seasons with that person. I think it's very, especially if you know that this is going like long term, you have to get comfortable with those conversations. But I guess it depends on your personality type. I'm more of a direct person. Like I need to know what I'm getting into before I get into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not comfortable talking about your finances and your credit score and your spending habits now, then I can't even imagine what it will be like, like being married to someone who, who might be secretive about that. So putting it all on the table, and I mean, like, even with someone like me knowing, that I went to graduate school, there's going to be some student loans attached to that. And so just inquiring about what that looks like, but not making assumptions.
And I think that and part of it, I guess, Nia, you could correct me if I'm wrong, and I feel like this could be like a whole other topic for a long, like a whole other segment. But I feel like maybe at least what I'm hearing is that it's not even as much about, whether or not you have some issues or you don't want to tell somebody about it. It's about then looking like, you're not just in this for love, or you're just looking at somebody because of like what their financial package is. And so maybe the question is, how do you, get that important information without it seeming like you're not looking at the relationship from a transactional point of view?
Yeah, it depends on what stage of the relationship it is when you're trying to retract that information. Like, I wouldn't advise that when you're just meeting someone, because that is a turn-off. Like, okay, this person's weird, don't want to see you again. But if we know that this is going to go steady, like if we've been in a relationship for a year or two and we haven't talked about money and, we're planning on getting married, or, we're living together already, whatever that case looks like, you're behind the curve, actually, completely behind the curve. And I don't think it's necessarily about, the negative or what they may say, but it's just a trust factor, right? So if you're honest about, man, I screwed over money, I have credit card debt early on in my 20s, I was just swiping and buying, that doesn't concern me as much as the fact that you were trying to hide it. So just being truthful and honest, because you can create a game plan to tackle that person's debt, right? If we're making $150,000 together, we can say, okay, cool, we can put a chunk of that towards this debt and break that down. Right. And then have that financial planner and advisor to work on the mindset so we won't have to get back into that same predicament again in the future.
Well, this was so eye-opening and enlightening. I feel a little lighter. I feel a little and I'm hoping.
I love it.
Remember, she said that I was correct.
Yeah.
Earlier on.
I will not hear the end of that.
It was at 5:37.
I don't remember. I have amnesia.
I will not hear the end of it.
Recorded, so.
Marriage is wonderful, everyone. Marriage is wonderful. I hope our listeners got as much out of this conversation as we did, as Jason and I did. Yeah, I think we'll definitely have to look into some of those suggestions. And they definitely are things that are doable. Certainly nothing that would, put us in uncomfortable positions. At the end of the day, it's just about being an adult, Got to grow up sometimes and make big, hard adult decisions. So, especially if you want to have a successful marriage. So thank you very much.
Definitely, that is always the goal.
Yes. Are there any parting words of wisdom that you would like to share with our listeners and ourselves before we do say goodbye?
Yeah, I would like to share with everyone that even though we talked about money and that could be a heavy topic, whether you're, in a good position in your relationship or marriage or not so good position in your relationship or marriage when it comes to money, just know that it doesn't have to stay that way. And whatever situation you're in, you can change it. And so if you're not in a good situation, just understand that you can have that kind of conversation with your partner to get back on track. This is not the end of it all, and this does not have to be the end of your relationship, but you do need to create a game plan of how to navigate this moving forward, so this will not be the end. And you will not end up in the category of this being one of the reasons why your relationship ends. So be encouraged. The fact that you're listening to this podcast right now shows how awesome you are in the willingness to work on your relationship. And as long as you're willing to grow and evolve, you're in the right spot.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
And where can people find you on social media?
I am everywhere. So you can find me on all things Kiaundra Jackson, which is LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And that's Kiaundra, last name Jackson. Or if you want to check out my website and get some free resources for your relationship, you can check out kwcouplestherapy.com. Again, that's kwcouples with an S, therapy.com.
Thank you. And for all of you listening, if you want to continue listening, you can, of course, find us on social media at Skooled Podcast. That's our Twitter handle. That's also our Instagram name. And then we are also, if you search Skooled Podcast, we're also on Facebook. So I thank you for joining us. I thank Kiaundra for joining us. I thank Jason for being honest and candid and bearing your soul, your financial soul. Until next time. Yes.
I think we just got schooled.
Yes, Jason. Yes, we did.
Love it.
Bye.